Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today's podcast is on social work with immigrants and refugees. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, an immigrant is someone who comes to a country to take up permanent residence. Now, this definition makes immigration seem pretty boring. I mean, you're just coming to a country to take up permanent residence. But if you believe the popular press in the United States, most immigrants sneak into the country at night in Texas or California, have something to do with an unscrupulous character called a coyote, and take jobs from legal residents and use taxpayer dollars to educate their children and pay for their health care. This image of the immigrant as villain sells papers and plays into an age-old theme in the United States that the stranger cannot be trusted. In fact, the majority of immigrants living in the United States are classified as legal permanent residents, that is, people who are authorized to live here permanently. The United States would not be the country it is today without immigrants. If you don't believe me, ask someone whose ancestors were here before the Pilgrims arrived 400 years ago. A refugee is someone who flees a country or power to avoid persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. For some people, being a refugee is a source of shame and embarrassment. For others, it's a badge of honor. Wyclef Jean, the founder and lead singer of the Washington, D.C.-based group The Fugees, is a refugee from Haiti, and he named his group The Fugees after the word refugee. The social work profession in the United States believes that immigration and refugee policies should simultaneously uphold and support equity and human rights and protect national security. Immigration policies must promote social justice and avoid racism and discrimination or profiling on the basis of race, religion, country of origin, gender, or other grounds. The National Association of Social Workers has a special interest in the impact of refugee and immigration policies on families and children. NASW supports policies that encourage family reunification and ensure that children do not grow up unduly disadvantaged by the immigration status of their parents. In today's podcast, I speak with Fernando Chang-Muy, JD, and Dr. Elaine Congress about their 2008 Springer publication, Social Work with Immigrants and Refugees, Legal Issues, Clinical Skills, and Advocacy. Fernando Chang-Muy is the Thomas O'Boyle Lecturer in Law at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law, where he teaches refugee law and policy. From 1988 to 1993, he served as legal officer with two United Nations agencies, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the World Health Organization, serving as the Human Rights Officer for its global program on AIDS. He's the recipient of numerous local and national awards, and in July 2008, Philadelphia Mayor Michael Nutter appointed him to the board of the Philadelphia Human Relations Commission. Elaine Congress is professor and associate dean at Fordham University Graduate School of Social Services. Dr. Congress has published extensively in the area of cultural diversity and ethics. A biography of Elaine's publications is available on the podcast website, and listeners of the Social Work Podcast will recognize Dr. Congress from our recent interview on the Cultureogram, a visual assessment tool she developed to help practitioners individualize families from diverse cultural backgrounds. I asked Elaine and Fernando why they thought it was important to have legal and social work perspectives in a book on working with immigrants and refugees. Most of our conversation was about the interface between social services and legal systems and how social workers and lawyers can work together when helping immigrants and refugees, and some of the ways that professionals can advocate for immigrants and refugees at a policy level. We ended our conversation talking about how the concepts discussed in today's podcast and the book can be applied to people who live in countries other than the United States. Now, quick note before we start the interview. I used Skype to record this interview because Elaine was in New York and Fernando and I were in Philadelphia. So without further ado, on to the podcast with Fernando Chang-Muy and Dr. Elaine Congress on social work with immigrants and refugees. So how did you come to co-author a text on immigrants and refugees?
Very, very interesting question. And I will tell you that our editor, Jennifer Perillo, really was the matchmaker. Fernando knows a lot about social workers. I mean, he's taught in social work school as well as in law school. And in fact, he had been interviewed for an article on social work with immigrants, and Jennifer had approached him about doing a book on social work practice and issues with immigrants. Also, I knew Jennifer because I published with Springer, and I have a book, 2 editions of a book, Multicultural Perspectives in Working with Families. So Jennifer approached me if I would like to meet Fernando and work with him on social work with immigrants and refugees. And this is something I've been very interested in for many years, ever since I first started in practice as a social worker, when I worked with many immigrants from Latin American countries. And I know Fernando also has been very interested and worked with immigrants for many years.
Clearly you both have interest in this area, but why have legal and social work perspectives as opposed to, say, legal and public health or education and social work? What is it about having legal and social work perspectives together that's so important?
It's become increasingly apparent that it's not, in order to provide direct practice, you really need to understand the legal and policy context in order to effectively help immigrants and refugees.
Unfortunately, immigration lawyers, tend to be unilateral, and they think that after they help their clients regularize their status, the work ends there. And unfortunately, that's not true, because people's lives are impacted by the law, by the Public Health Department, by the Department of Agriculture, which issues food stamps. It would be wonderful if in an ideal world, after the lawyer finishes helping the individual with their legal issues, getting a green card, they could then transfer them or refer them to social workers to help them with the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen very often, so that's why the melding together of immigration and social work would be great. It'll be the immigration lawyers who will not see this text, and hopefully if an immigrant first approaches a social worker, the social worker then might approach the lawyer and try to have the two industries or the two sectors work together.
In the introduction to your text, Social Work with Immigrants and Refugees, you invoke this idea of the stranger and set out to answer the question, how to welcome the stranger. What do you mean by welcome the stranger?
Well, I'm reminded of whatever culture you're from, whether you're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or Buddhist, there are always these principles of welcoming the stranger. So I'm reminded of the Torah. It says, welcome the stranger. I'm reminded of, in the Muslim tradition, there's a statement that says, even if there's a stranger, a non-Muslim among you, you should help that person and convey them to safety. There's the golden rule of Buddhism. There's the treat others as you would be treated in Christianity. So cultures have these similar patterns and thinking of welcoming those who are not like us. There's always a stranger among us. There's always someone fleeing their country of origin for either human rights reasons or economic reasons, and this text aims to help the readers, in this case social workers, better understand how to welcome the stranger, that new person who's just arrived in our midst.
There are 2 assumptions in your text, and one is that immigrants and refugees need help, and the other is that social workers should help. So in your text, you have chapters on the needs of immigrants and refugees, including issues of physical and mental health, children and families, education, issues of sexual orientation and gender preference, aging, and legal advocacy. Can you talk about 1 or 2 things that social workers need to know to help immigrants and refugees?
Well, immigrants often have some difficulties accessing social services, health care, and they may not know where to go, know how to work with these systems, and social workers can really help them access these systems and services that they need. Also, many immigrants have issues about their legal status, and certainly social workers can and should refer to lawyers who can help them with this status. I think an important lesson for all social workers is we learned in Social Work 101 to really begin with where the client is. And in order to do that, social workers really have to understand the client. I have a culturegram, a family assessment tool that I developed that really helps a social worker look at a client in terms of 10 different aspects. And this can be very helpful.
You and I did a podcast on the Culturegram, and listeners can access that on the Social Work Podcast website. And so you're saying that using this Culturegram is one of the tools that social workers can use when working with immigrants and refugees.
Right. And that's, that could be really helpful because you have to really assess the person that you're working with and see where they are, where they've come from. After this assessment, then you're able to move on to plan treatment and intervention.
Yeah, I'd like to add, Jonathan, that one of the things, and this is to underscore what Elaine just said, one of the things that social workers need to know to help immigrants and refugees is legal issues. So right up front in the text, we have a whole chapter devoted to what's a green card, what's a refugee, what's a U.S. citizen, how do people come in. And again, the goal is not to turn the reader or the social work practitioner into a lawyer, but just to be familiar with these terms. Whether we like it or not, the demographics of the U.S. are changing, and social workers need to stay in tune with the changing demographics, and also with the law. So this is especially important in the southern states, in Florida, and California, Arizona, Texas, but all over. Even North Carolina has seen an explosion of immigrants. The other thing, Jonathan, you said that the text talks about how immigrants and refugees need help. Throughout the text, though, not only do our authors talk about how immigrants and refugees need help, but they also talk about the strengths and assets that the immigrant and refugee community brings. So sure, it's the nature of the beast of social work practice, and it's the nature of immigration practice that people come to us with need, I need help. But throughout, we remind the reader that the newcomers also bring strengths and assets.
Well, I appreciate you pointing that out, because I think that does too often get lost in the mix. We start thinking about our clients as simply people who have problems, as opposed to people who have a lifetime worth of resources. And unless we are able to tap into those, then we're really doing our clients and ourselves a disservice. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Is there something in particular that you can think of maybe that was addressed in one of these chapters about issues of physical and mental health, children and families, that could be a challenge on one hand, and then an example of maybe something that these families bring as resources, or these immigrants bring as resources or strengths?
Sure. Well, just talking about children, the challenge is that the public school system, the administrators may not be familiar with rights of children. And so a challenge is sometimes a public school district will prevent a child from enrolling in school. So that's a challenge for the parents and, of course, the child. The strength or asset is actually the child itself. Look at the winners of the Westinghouse Science Contest. Look at winners of spelling bees. Look at the talent that's been developed here of either children born U.S. citizen children born of immigrants, or immigrant children coming here and eventually becoming lawful permanent residents and U.S. citizens. So the challenge is not with the newcomers. The challenge is with the system that prevents access to services, in this case public education. And the success is the children themselves, the children of immigrants or those children who were born abroad, are bringing great resources to this country. So I used to work with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and they had this really great poster. It was black background, and one light was shining on the face of Albert Einstein, and the wording on the very simple poster was, Einstein was a refugee. And look what he brought to our country. So in opening doors, we help people, but we also help those of us who are already here help ourselves by accepting these brains who are coming in either at the very high level as well as the low blue-collar level, the picking mushrooms, the working in the chicken factories, the doing the landscaping, all that's done by immigrant labor.
And you're talking about helping folks, and one of my other questions is how can social workers and lawyers work together to help immigrants and refugees, and specifically how do the legal and social work perspectives on helping immigrants and refugees differ and maybe complement each other?
It's incumbent on both professions to cross-refer. And fortunately, the social work profession and in social work school, that is the ethos. Let's collaborate, let's work with others. And I'll criticize my own profession and the legal profession, we're taught very silo-ish ways of thinking. I'm a contracts lawyer, I'm an immigration lawyer, intellectual property lawyer. I'll do my thing and forget about working with others. And so it's incumbent, I'll put the burden on the legal profession to, as I previously mentioned, that after they work with the person in helping them with just that one focused issue, getting a green card or getting regularized, that they say, and by the way, have you thought of going to agency X 2 blocks away so that someone there can help you with housing issues or with access to getting a medical card or getting a job? You've been working and now it's time to do this up front and to pay your back taxes. But so that's one way that lawyers and social workers can work together. If the client first approaches the social worker, the first thing that the social worker to do is to do an assessment, the cultural gram assessment as well as a legal assessment. And if the person needs immigration assistance, to refer to the appropriate public interest lawyer or private lawyer. And that's how they can complement each other, by knowing each other's issues and by knowing that they exist and identifying good resources, the social worker identifying good public interest immigration firms where they're located, or honest private attorneys, and vice versa, that the lawyer knows who are the good social workers in the area, what are the agencies that they work in, and make the appropriate referrals.
I think that's very important, that it's a two-way street, because one basic difference I've always felt is that lawyers really are like client focus. I mean, you have like one case. You don't have a family case. You represent one person, one client, in terms of his or her immigration status. While social workers always have much more of a family approach, and this is a different way of kind of doing business, if you will. But it really would work out well if there's referral back and forth and ongoing collaboration.
It sounds like setting up mixers with lawyers and social workers who work with immigrants and refugees might not be a bad idea.
That's interesting.
So when I was in Austin as a social worker, I helped to start a group called the Austin Spanish-Speaking Mental Health Professional Network, and it was an informal network of mental health providers who spoke Spanish, and we had a listserv, and it was really a way for us to post something on the list saying, hey, I've got a family, and they've got domestic violence issue, or they've got sexual abuse, or they've got this, that, and the other thing. Is there somebody out there who's got an opening? What resources are available? And it really turned into this fabulous resource for mental health providers. It's still going. What we never did is we never really thought about expanding it and opening it up to what I think we would have thought of as sort of auxiliary services, like lawyers or medical professionals outside of the mental health field. But as you're talking, it really sounds like that is a very valuable service to have some sort of linkage between these two groups. Now, in your text on immigrants and refugees, you write about Drachman's 3-part approach to social work practice with immigrant families. The first part you mentioned was understanding the immigrants' relationship to their country of origin, and the second part was how they got here, which Drachman calls transit. Can you talk about the third part of the approach?
The third part is a client or family situation here in the United States. I'm going to give an example about how knowing only the third part was not as helpful as when we really learned more about the first and the second part. We spoke a little while before about education and some of the issues in terms of education. This happened in a public school. There was an 8-year-old boy who was just very tearful all the time and just didn't speak, didn't get involved at all. And then finally we found out he was from a Central American country. He spoke only Spanish and was a Spanish-speaking social worker. We were able to learn his history. Apparently his father belonged to a dissident political group in this country and was taken away in the middle of the night, probably killed. His uncle had smuggled him and his mother out of the country, and they came up through Mexico, entered as undocumented people, and it was a very difficult transit. So it was really helpful for us to understand the first part of his history and you can imagine how traumatic it was for him having to leave his home in the middle of the night, completely leave behind his familiar environment. And also it was such a difficult time traveling first across the border and then up to New York. So I think this illustrates why we shouldn't just focus on what we see in front of us, the actual current situation of the immigrant, but really have to keep in mind the earlier parts of their lives.
Yeah, I would agree, and especially in the refugee context, as opposed to the immigration context. A refugee in their country of origin may have suffered torture. Maybe even someone in the medical profession may have done the torture. And then secondly, in the transit, is raped. And now they're here. And so the triple trauma, it helps to know what happened in the country of origin. It helps to know what happened in transit, so that, for example, the doctor does not suddenly shine a light in the person's eye, which is the way that they may have been tortured in the country of origin. And a male doctor may want to recuse himself and not see the patient because the patient was raped in transit to this country. And so, as Elaine just mentioned, knowing what happened in the country of origin, knowing what happens in transit, helps provide better service now that they're here, and so that they won't be equally traumatized in the United States. Now, this is where actually immigration lawyers who do refugee law processing will get this information out, because that is actually the meat of a refugee story. You have to tell what happened in your country of origin and why are you afraid of being persecuted. Whereas a practitioner, a social worker in a hospital or a mental health social service agency might get to that as well, but others may not. So this is where the two can work together. Jonathan, I want to go back to your other question about social workers and lawyers working together. And I know that, and what you did in Texas is really great. There are more models like that happening around the country. In Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, where I live, there's actually an organization called the Pennsylvania Immigration and Citizenship Coalition, PICC. And the purpose of that coalition is exactly to do what you mentioned earlier, which is to bring people from diverse industries or work areas, social work, law, public sector, the Department of Health, the Department of X, Y, or Z, so that they all talk about how what's going on in their world impacts immigrants and refugees in the Philadelphia area. This model is happening as well as in New York, in Boston, in Illinois, and so more and more the different professions are seeing that they can rally around a population group. In this case, immigrants and refugees. Let's learn from each other. Let's talk about what's going on with driver's licenses, with housing, with state legislation, with federal legislation, and then we can share information together.
That's great. And we can put the link to that group on the Social Work Podcast website.
Yep. And that the link is pic-pa.org, PICC-pa.org.
So you're talking about sort of an interdisciplinary group of folks that get together around a population, in this case immigrants and refugees, and how they can affect legislation. And I was wondering, because I know that you talk about this in the book, but what policies or pieces of legislation that affect immigrants and refugees should our listeners be aware of? And how can social workers best advocate on a policy level for their immigrant and refugee clients?
Sure. The answer to that question is going to depend on where the listeners are. But city councils, state governments often try to pass laws that may have an impact on immigrants. So it's important for the social worker to be aware of that and then to see what, if anything, can be done. So, for example, in the city of Hazleton, a city in Pennsylvania, there was discussion of turning landlords into agents of the Immigration Service. In other situations, there have been proposed legislation saying that only U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents can apply for a marriage license. And so these are all city and state laws that impact immigrants. So the first thing, of course, is just to know what's going on. And then taking it to the next level, social workers might be used to working on one-on-one case or in a family situation, as Elaine mentioned, but may not be as used to working on systemic change. And so the last chapter of the text raises awareness to the reader that indeed just as important it is for you to work on in direct clinical issues and on one-on-one in families, it's also important that social workers marshal with other social workers and other people interested in the issue to try to affect systemic change. In this case, it could be city laws, state laws, or federal laws that impact on immigrants. And many social workers work in nonprofit organizations, which are prohibited from, quote, lobbying, but are not prohibited from educating. And there is a distinction. So the last chapter in the book talks about why it's important to work on systems change, why it's important for social workers to know the difference between lobbying, educating, and how 501c3 nonprofit organizations, where many social workers might work in, can educate policymakers and do that legally.
So what is the difference between educating and lobbying? Just briefly.
Sure. Well, for that, you'll have to read the book, Jonathan. But it's okay to go to a specific policymaker and say, we're concerned about how policies might affect our clients. So according to the folks from Alliance for Justice, lobbying is when you are for or against a specific piece of legislation, or you proclaim you're for or against a specific incumbent, and that is expressly prohibited. But you can go and raise awareness with legislators and talk about the strengths of immigrant kids, how today's immigrant kid might be tomorrow's Einstein, and how they need to be aware of that.
That's great. Well, thank you. And certainly if you're interested in more information, of course, detailed information, you can find it in the book. Now, I guess the last question that I have for you is something that touches on something that we've talked about on and off throughout this podcast, which is that there are listeners of the podcast who don't live in the United States. And for listeners in other countries, how might they make sense of the information that we've talked about in today's interview that was specific to the United States?
Well, first, let me just say that migration is occurring all over the world. We're very aware of it here in the United States. People are moving around the world, and of course the move is primarily from developing countries to developed country, but it's happening everywhere. At the UN, I've been involved with an NGO committee on migration, and we've looked at immigration patterns, and usually, similar to the United States, there are many issues in countries in terms of the way that immigrants are received. It's true that laws may differ and are somewhat unique to each country, but definitely in terms of social work skills in working, say, in a health setting with immigrants or in an education system with immigrants, probably really would carry over. Also, I just want to mention the phenomenon of transnationalism. What we really see now is that many immigrants really are part of two countries, really are bicultural, and very often they physically travel back and forth, or even if they don't physically travel because of modern technology and emails and cell phone, they're able to have continual contact with people who they've left behind. So this is another reason why this book is applicable not only to U.S. social workers, but really social workers all over the world. And there are probably about 750,000 social workers around the world.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's a lot of social workers.
So, right.
And Jonathan, even though the chapter on the legal part uses words like getting a green card, in Canada it might be a different word like becoming a landed immigrant. But the principles are there. Most countries recognize refugee status, and the text explains what's a refugee. Most countries give lawful permanent residence to foreigners, and they may not use those words like getting a green card, but the principles still apply across the board. And again, although the laws, the word, the terminology might be different, the issues, the strengths and challenges that people face are the same. An abused woman in the U.S. is still an abused woman in England. And so a social worker, be they in England or the U.S., might still find the chapter on immigrant women and the particular issues of battered immigrant women. That's going to cut across countries and borders.
Right, and another important issue, probably in all countries, immigrants are discriminated against and are often the subject of biased crimes and oppressive policies. And I think it's very important for social workers, because we're very concerned about promoting social justice, to identify when this occurs and to really advocate to make a change within their own countries.
To bring it right back around to the beginning when we talked about the welcoming the stranger, it really sounds like the text that you wrote is really meant as a way of both educating social workers about legal perspectives, but as kind of a bridge-building book between the professions, and ultimately as a way of addressing issues of social justice from a strengths perspective around this population of immigrants and refugees.
Just to follow up on what you said, we're trying to get the book in legal clinics, for example, and there are many law schools around the country which have a legal immigration clinic. And again, the young student is a mirror image of the older immigration lawyer who sees the client, helps them get a green card, and says goodbye. And hopefully with this text, the young law student in an immigration clinic might pick up the book and say, oh, the problem doesn't stop here. Now that I've gotten my client a green card, there might be other issues that they might be facing: employment, health, mental health, issues of abuse. Let me see if I can refer them to a social worker.
That would be great.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and many schools, I know we do at Fordham and also at the University of Pennsylvania, have joint law and social work programs.
Exactly.
And in fact, there are some classes, integrative seminars, in which there are both law students and social work students, in which it's a wonderful time to have them begin to discuss some of these issues, to help them form relationships in terms of working with immigrant clients.
Elaine and Fernando, thank you so much for talking with me today about immigrants and refugees. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I really enjoyed having the opportunity to talk with you again, Jonathan, and also with you, Fernando, about one of my favorite topics on social work with immigrants and refugees.
And thank you, Jonathan, for being adaptable and flexible and raising awareness, not just through books and lectures, but through this new emerging technology, which isn't that emerging. But this is podcasts are able to reach more people. So thank you for your advocacy, and thank you, Elaine, for this journey for the past year in putting this book together. And of course to Jennifer Perillo at Springer Publications.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.